Hi, welcome to another video. As we paint this lovely young lady bathed in natural warm and cool lights of this tree canopy. The focus of this week's video will deal with edges, as they are a cornerstone of good painting. I'll give you tips throughout this video on some of the tools, my favorite tools that I use, and some of the ones that I haven't even shown you yet in previous videos that I have a tendency to use quite often. If you're new to my channel, my name is Zorn, and here we mostly have fun with art, really. I teach experimentation with different mediums and how to push boundaries of representational and abstract art. Do consider joining us if you find that of interest to you. As Christmas approaches and we wind down this year, I wanted to sit down and ponder where to go with this channel for the next little while. Truthfully, my kids, and particularly my son, egged me on to share my passion here on YouTube a little over a month ago and teach all that I've learned throughout these almost 25 years of professional art experience. And taking their advice further, I thought I'd share this kid portrait with you and maybe a few more in the coming months. Truthfully, I like painting kids. They are very difficult to paint as a portrait, as they have very delicate lines, very symmetrical faces. As you can see in this preliminary drawing that I'm doing of Vivian here, I'm defining where some of the hard and soft edges, where some of the lights and darks of her face will be, because that will be the focal point of this painting. Also, because this is a community that I'm trying to build here of like-minded people who share this passion for art. If you have any interests in subject matter you'd like me to cover using some of my methods, traditional ones or non-traditional ones, comment down below and I'm sure I'll get to them at some point in the future. As we start this week's demonstration, I should apologize from the beginning for this awkward camera angle. I promise I shifted the camera in a few minutes here so you get to see more of the painting. I was unaware really that my head is so prominently showing during this initial stage. I decided to keep everything, however, this footage, because it's so important to show and to share some of the tips that I sort of put down in the beginning stages of painting that serve as some sort of a guide, I guess, for all the subsequent layers. This is a sizable piece, really the limits of what I can paint in a day. It's a 25 by 19 inch Alla Prima portrait, with the drawing being transferred and a light yellow ochre underpainting applied. I'm using this special tool, which is called a catalyst here in Canada. It's like a two-sided squeegee. On one side, it's a 1.5 inch. On the other side, is 3 inch. I am just putting down middle tone values and some of the darker darks somewhat whimsically. I'm applying them obviously based on a reference, but I am not limited by the drawing. Drawing obviously serves a purpose, and particularly if you're trying to get a likeness, which I am here. But this initial stage, mark making, is deliberate, somewhat intuitive, and I'm kind of dancing around the substrate with it. I'm applying marks in the background. I've got a palette knife now. I'm defining some edges with regards to branches. As you can see in the reference photo of the finished painting on the bottom left, she's standing in a canopy with warm and cool lights on her body, on her face, on her cheeks. This was a real challenge to get right. I mean, you've got a lot of reflected light. It's very warm. I found it somewhat a great representation really for this child, representing obviously the environment, but also just the purity and innocence of her and kids in general. So I've got the warmth obviously coming in from a reflective source at the bottom. It's got the cool light, somewhat cool, coming in from the sides of her face. And knowing that, I'm basically putting down these initial layers of paint that I will subsequently mold into various edges, whether they're soft or hard. I will cover in depth in a few minutes what I mean by that exactly. Now, another special tool that again I use quite often with a lot of portraits, cityscapes, of course, and landscapes. This is a brass squeegee. Just like the other catalyst tool that I mentioned earlier, I forgot to mention, you can apply paint or reduce paint. So in this case, it's just sort of making lines. Some are gestural, many are indicating to me where things will be placed subsequently. But I think the reason I like these tools is that it helps me balance technical skills with creative intuition. It's in a way you're seeing relationships, you're observing how shapes, colors, and tones interact. We were always told in school, art school, always use a tool, a brush for example, that's a size larger than you would normally use, which kind of makes things more gestural, expressive. I'm not after, doing fine details at this stage of the painting process. I'm into big picture thinking, if you want to call it that. You're visualizing the artwork as a whole rather than its parts. You want to get some emotion behind those strokes and not focus on minute details. And now I'm showing the side window of my palette, which is down to the right of me. I'm mixing with this Squeegee catalyst tool that I'm applying to the right there. You can see it. Some of the marks now are on top of the earlier marks we've made already in place. So this is, as I said, Alla Prima portrait, and everything, of course, is wet on wet with no medium. I do use medium. I use liquid medium, impasto medium as well. But for this portrait, paint was applied directly with no medium. Now I'm using a brush as well to lay out some of the foliage in that canopy and to give variety to the marks, really. Squeegee and the catalyst tool, as well as, of course, a knife, lay a very chiseled, flat sort of brush mark. Brush, of course, gives, depending on obviously how you hold it, you can drag it, you can apply a thick amount of paint. I will put a link down below of my last week's video where we painted a landscape. I covered in depth how I tend to use brushes and how to get more deliberate, crisp lines with color with your brush as well. Now here again, another tool, that Squeegee brush that I've previously used on my portrait work. This is the larger version of that brush. This is a 1-inch, half-inch, it has two sides to it. That again, I'm applying paint, taking away paints. Essentially, you'll notice a pattern with most of my work, and that is we construct and then we deconstruct. I paint something and then remove it. And hopefully at the end of that process, you'll get something that's visually appealing. I wanted to do a side companion mini demo just to explain edges so that everyone understands what their role is in painting. There really are three important aspects to consider when dealing with soft and hard edges in any painting. Before getting to them, however, let me define what hard and soft edges are. Hard edges, like the ones that I just applied on that side screen with the value 1 black beside the value 9 gray, are essentially gestural marks that are very crisp and clearly defined. And their role is to draw attention to specific areas of the painting. Hard edges are essential for focal points or areas where you want to capture the viewer's eyes, such as, in our case, the girl's contours over subject of the face, uh, the glimpse of her eyes maybe, or if you recall from the initial drawing, the collar underneath her chin, which will have the largest contrast as well. Now, the soft edges, these are obviously the opposite. Some call them diffused or disappearing. It's just the gradation of soft edge. These are diffused and transition smoothly, essentially, to surrounding areas. They create a sense of depth, atmosphere, or emotion, and are ideal for less important areas, like in our case, the foliage in the background. It plays a vital role, of course, in the overall design of the painting, but it doesn't have that much prominence, and it needs to be out of focus to an effect. Essentially, soft edges help guide the viewer's eyes away from the distractions and maintain emphasis at the focal point. On the mini demo, as you can tell there, I've blended value 1 and value 9 hard edge that I initially put down to create somewhat of a softer edge between them. That's one of the easiest ways to create soft edges between value color. Below that, I've painted the exact same thing, sort of the distance between value 1 to value 9, but in this case, I've included all of the subsequent values between them, so 8, 7, 6 onward down to 1. And this is a way to create soft edges between values that are extreme distance from one another on a value scale. If you do want to create hard edges in your work, painting knife, which I've just applied there on the left, is a great way to do that, as well as that Squeegee brush. You can see that I'm applying this green over a burnt sienna, I believe, base, and I'm actually even blending some of the under color with that green, which again can be used for that purpose. You can create a strict hard edge, or you can blend with it or reduce color with it. And here I am reducing color with a paper towel. I'm knocking back some of the edges in her clothing. General rule is, for me at least, keep everything soft as much as possible throughout the process, and then intensify certain sections where you want the eye to sort of lead. I've showcased the side view of this portrait as I'm applying paint, just so you can see some of the soft edges in her hair and in the background to an extent. I'm applying color directly now with a brush, but as you can tell, that background, which will be built up with more layers, is quite abstract and relatively loose as well. Now, those three important aspects to consider with all your edges. One we've kind of covered now already, which again essentially is just setting this hierarchy. You're defining focus. Hard edges are usually reserved for the most important part of your painting, especially if they are so spaced out on the value scale. So for example, if you recall from that demonstration I just did, if it's like a 1 value beside a 10 and it has a hard edge, that will be very visually impactful. So setting that focus, setting hierarchy is one aspect to consider. The other, maybe more pertinent for landscape work, is creating depth and dimension. Hard edges often used are often used in the foreground elements to separate objects from their background. They give a sense of, I guess, solidity and clarity, making whatever is in the front appear closer to the viewer, as opposed to soft edges, which suggest distance or atmospheric perspective. And the other thing, the third thing that's also somewhat overlooked when it comes to edges, is their ability to express mood and texture. And I'll talk a bit more about that later on. Now to our screen here, I wanted to do this sort of close-up view of her face, just to show you how I apply some of these marks. Now, I don't make these kind of whimsical gestural marks for the whole painting. I want diversity with mark making, like I do with edges, like I do with color. but I wanted to show you just how to create this visual appeal with this way of applying paint onto your substrate. Is this jumping around, applying right color values, but not being limited by your visual reference. And here on this side view, you can see I'm getting close to completing her face. There's some areas of the cheeks and her chin that needs to still be rendered. For the most part, I like how it reads visually. There's a lot of life to her face there already, a lot of warmth from, if you recall from the beginning, talk about this. The front of their face is very warm with cadmium oranges, cadmium reds, yellows. There's some greens as you sort of get closer to the edge of her face where the light is bluish. But it's that process I talked about already where you apply these little notes of color to sort of mold and shape a form. I'll do another small demo later on in a few minutes just to show you visually how I do that. Essentially, these edges are by nature hard, that when they get placed on a value scale between one another, they create this visual rounding or visual form that's soft. Now onto that tree in the left. That is somewhat of, I guess, a secondary focus. It plays obviously a secondary role to the model here, but I need to bring that out a bit more rendered. I can't have it be more abstract than, I guess, the right side of her head there, which will be relatively abstract. I wanted to have that tree pop out a little bit more, just to give some sort of visual appeal as well to that side. I'm using that Squeegee brush to essentially create form through wet on wet layering. I've applied the darkest tones of that, I believe it's a birch tree, initially, and then I apply various hues of color on top of that. Again, birch trees being white or off-white, or if you want to call them bluish. I don't paint anything really, any form is strictly based on their, if you want to call it local color or whatever. I add all sorts of different hues of color as long as I adhere to that warm color, cool color theory that I've covered somewhat in my previous videos. And that way, essentially, you create visual realism, essentially. And I'm doing that now with this Squeegee tool that I've talked about earlier. I'm using it now to build up more layers, more interest behind that model with the branches. It's got paint on it, and depending on how I'm holding it, I can either wipe paint away or add paint on. And sometimes I do that in one single stroke. So there you saw, for example, I'm adding some canopy darks on the top left side, and I'm adding some highlights to that tree on the left. Now that I've built up the foreground to somewhat of a completion, I felt it was imperative to build up some of the background color. I mean, by default, if you recall from art classes in grade school, really, you work from the background to the front sort of ground. I don't have a rule with that either. Sometimes I do that, but a lot of times I work on the subject matter. In fact, more often than not, I work on the subject matter, the thing that I want to sort of communicate to the viewer, and then build the things around them. And then lastly, as it often happens, I build up the background last. Now, what this background will do, it will make everything pop out. It will create more hard edges because we are delineating further with sort of the value jumping that's happening. Here you've got the white coming in of the background, off-white coming in, and I will knock back a lot of that wanted to get towards the end of it, but I felt it was important to sort of put it in now. Now the companion window on the right there that's just come up is that example of how I generally approach this concept of soft edges through color cues. I don't often blend color by putting one down and then the other one beside it and then sort of blend it with a brush. I often do that visually through this value sort of step down or step up. So where in this case, for example, I'm putting down I believe that's a Payne's gray that's been lit up with a bit of yellow ochre and titanium white. So I'm creating form through building up of individual mosaic tiles. And in that sense, you got this visual interest across this whole value spectrum, as opposed to just two colors that are mishmashed and blended with a brush, which are okay, but more often than not can create muddy color. If you recall from that initial drawing I did in front of my Christmas tree, I wanted her collar, her school collar white, to pop out and be one of the hardest edges of this painting. I had thought that her chin would also be a harder edge than it ended up being, but sometimes throughout the painting process things change. You don't always adhere to everything that you set out in the beginning. It turned out that her hair, and particularly the left side of her hair, was one of the harder edges, as it's quite dark, and I didn't render much of her hair. It's quite dark against a relatively light background. But this collar I really wanted to sort of have pop out. It's got that black dress underneath, which I've kept entirely abstract, but I've applied titanium white directly adjacent to it in a relatively hard edge manner. So that edge ended up reading as the hardest of the painting, as I wanted the viewer to sort of gravitate towards that area and then lead up to her face, which is quite warm, as we discussed. As mentioned earlier, with respect to things to consider when dealing with soft and hard edges, the three defining characteristics, the third one I feel is appropriate to mention now, and that is in its ability to express mood through texture. Okay, so now that we're at the end of this painting process, and I'm putting in this interestingly enough, yellow ochre directly from the tube to create mood and texture. Hard edges can evoke the sharp, clear, tense mood, depending on the subject, of course. They also depict textures like metal, glass, or maybe architectural details in a certain precise way. Soft edges contribute to this serenity, dreamlike, or painterly mood, which I hope that I was able to sort of convey through this painting. There's this transience to them, and that's why I always propagate with my students to focus on soft edges as much as possible and not have too many hard edges. There's a place for them, but you don't want to have them used too much. And here we are at the very end of this portrait, as I'm putting in final little details, highlights, if you want to call them the lightest lights of her face. You can see all the little abstract marks that I've applied. As you can see there, I initially wasn't going to include this little frame, as it was just showing me signing the painting. Even though it's out of focus, I figured let's add this because it shows her clothing on the left there and the abstract nature of it. It really is a defining characteristic of a lot of my work, where things are relatively abstract depending on how viewed or how far away you are from the painting. As I approach the painting from up close, I've taken the camera off the tripod. You can see all the little hues of color, all the little abstract marks that were made with that squeegee brush, with that squeegee tool, the catalyst tool, and the brush as well as the palette knife. It has this ephemeral, it has this sense of divinity, I think. Just there's this warmth to it. I was quite happy with how impactful this painting became. But overall, there's this sense of emotion, especially with the subject being as innocent as she is. I hope I was able to sort of communicate that through this process. The next video, which will come out in a few days' time, will deal with the underpainting and its ability to be used as a design element. It's quite interesting, so do come back. Thank you for watching, and any questions, as usual, put down your comments down below. See you next time.